Okay, folks, welcome to my third and final review of Bloodruth #1, in which I declare it try-hard horror. I say try-hard because I don't really feel like the Soska Sisters actually stick the landing as far as the horror is concerned, which is surprising to me, because as I understand it, they are big on the horror movie scene. And yet, the sense of horror doesn't pervade Bloodruth the way that I would think it would in a horror comic. Now, Michael Montanat, of course, does his best, and he does an admirable job of trying to portray the kind of images that the Soskas want in there, and by and large, I think he does a magnificent job, even though there are some artistic choices of his that I have some issues with, and I've gone over that largely in my first video on Bloodruth #1 called Supernaturally Subpar Setup. But all in all, I'd say he's doing a good job as the Bloodruth #1 artist, and I think Eric July was right to pick him for the job. So my main problem with Bloodruth #1 is that I find it to be an example of kitchen sink comic book making. And by that, I mean somebody who was thinking this comic book up said something to the effect of, throw in everything but no, on second thought, throw the kitchen sink in there too. There's just so much packed into this book, and not in a good way. Sometimes you can pack in too much. My ideal overview for Bloodruth #1 would look something like this. First, you would have an introductory conflict of some kind, like her fight with the Hellions in the cemetery, and this would establish the current status quo, and it would also give us an idea of what is her basic power set, because this is a #1 issue after all. There are going to be a lot of people who are coming to Bloodruth for the first time through this book, especially since it precedes her first appearance in ISOM #2. So if you're going to present this as a #1 comic, you really ought to establish that she has a particular set of blood magic powers in here. And then you have her primary conflict, and this is where she really gets a chance to shine. She'll be fighting a greater demon inside the mysterious castle in the desert that she discovers, and this is what gives her the chance to impress the reader and show off her skills and her personality and make her someone that the reader wants to know more about in the future. Then you have the consequences of the primary conflict, in which Bloodruth will discover a horrifying secret that lurks within the castle that completely overthrows her status quo and establishes a new one. And that, to me, this is a great structure for a #1 issue. Now, what is the actual structure of Bloodruth #1? Boom! Oh my God, look at all this. You just threw every possible thing into this book. We're going to go over these things one at a time. Let me go ahead and wipe the slate clean here because I'm already getting overwhelmed just looking at it. That was a huge amount of stuff, and hopefully you can actually pull off a book that is structured well enough to include that many elements. But in the case of Bloodruth #1, I don't think that's actually what was accomplished here. Now, in the mythical prologue, we get the story, as told by the Soska Sisters, of Cain and Abel. It's not exactly biblically accurate, but close enough for Rippaverse work. And in this story, we get the origin of what exactly? It's not really clear what this Cain and Abel story is supposed to be telling us, because in the introductory conflict, which is the fight in the cemetery, we get three different kinds of terminology springing out of the one story. And actually, I think only the first two come from the prologue. You've got the cursed bloodline that Bloodruth has, and then you've got the damned, who I'm thinking are the descendants of Cain. I'm not exactly sure. And then on top of that, you have the Hellions, who are these extra-dimensional beings who have somehow come into our world. That's per ISOM #2. So what exactly are you trying to show us the origin of with that prologue? I would have just left that prologue out altogether at that point. Now, one problem with the introductory conflict itself is that it doesn't establish the basic power set of Bloodruth. Look at the fighting she does. This is not blood magic. All she does is exhibit some strength. She exhibits the ability to throw stakes into the hearts of vampires, and later on she'll jump through a stained glass window in a church, but that's about it. What exactly are you establishing in this introductory conflict? Moreover, you've got multiple threats assaulting her, and I'm not going to tell you what the other threat is. I'm going to have to keep some spoilers out of this presentation just so that I don't reveal everything that's in the book. But you've got two enemies here in the introductory conflict, and do you really need both? One would be enough to establish her power set. Then we get our secondary hero, which of course is Gooding. And Gooding is there because, well, we need something to connect the dots with ISOM number 2. Because in ISOM number 2, Gooding already knows about Bloodruth, and he introduces Avery to Bloodruth through his knowledge of her from this issue, apparently. He doesn't really do much else. All you've got is him standing by while Bloodruth goes into the castle and does her work, and he's just gonna monitor and keep guard and make sure nobody else goes into the castle in the meantime. So he's not playing really a huge role, and I think he probably could have been left out of this book with maybe a page or two contribution, but he didn't have to play as large of a role as he did, other than to do the what Ethan Van Sciver called a meet cute between himself and Bloodruth, where the two of them fight before finally settling down and realizing they're not enemies. Then you've got the secondary villains arriving, and this, of course, is Michael Copper and Lillian Renashi. They are there to set the stage for their own upcoming books, The Cursed, written by Jen Soska, and The Black Eye Club, written by Sylvia Soska. But otherwise, there's really no reason for them to be in the book, and there certainly is no reason for the inconsequential nobody who is Stefania Martinez to be in this book, especially since she doesn't make another showing throughout the rest of the issue. All this is a gratuitous Yaira plug. Yaira number 2 is coming out soon, and one of the covers features Stefania on it. So that's really the only reason that she's there, is to be a Yaira plug, even though they don't make use of an editor's box saying, oh, you want to see more of this girl? Go look at Yaira number 1 and possibly number 2. Now, finally, we are at the primary conflict, but before we get into that, I want to go over some pre-conflict commentary on a couple of panel sets prior to the primary conflict. They're both going to be dealing with Bloodruth entering the castle, and here she starts off by noting that there are gators in the lake and it reminds her of home. And this is one of the major problems I have with the Soska Sisters' approach to this comic, is that they are not allowing horror to come through. When Bloodruth sees the gators and says, oh, reminds me of home, what do you think the reader is going to feel? She's walking into a castle that's packed with evil and so much magical stuff that Gooding can't even go inside. But she just feels like it's home, you know? This is just home to her. Well, yeah, if you want to make the reader feel at home when what the reader should be feeling is scared for her, then do this, you know? Write it like this. But otherwise, you want to leave the reader with some sort of sense of dread, because that's what we should be feeling in a horror comic. Then we have this broken, what was that, across 2 panels, and God, this does not work at all. When she's saying what in the first panel, I'm thinking she's just continuing things that she's telling Gooding, giving him instructions or something like that, and then all of a sudden it shifts gears. And even worse, the next set of lettering balloons go over whatever it is we're supposed to be looking at, so I have no idea what's down there in the water. That's another great way in which this book was not edited properly. In the next panels, we got Gooding saying dialogue that I don't think any human being on Earth would actually say. That place is cursed. A foul stench of death emanates from its walls, and I swore I heard the sound of screams just last night on my survey. That's garbage dialogue. And then, again, here we have Bloodruth saying, well, I hope I didn't miss all the fun, and just being dismissive. She's just batting it away. It reminds me of Bloodruth's actual first introduction to Rippaverse readers, because when Ethan Van Sciver drew the cover to ISOM number 2, he put these blasé, nonchalant looks on ISOM and Bloodruth's face, and I just remember looking at this cover and thinking, they look bored, and I feel bored. And that's the kind of sense I'm getting from the Soska's writing here. Bloodruth is bored, and so am I. So now, getting into the actual primary conflict, the first thing Bloodruth is going to do is fight a greater demon. And that greater demon, of course, is the 2-page spread demon, Choke. And how do we know he's a greater demon? Because we are flat out freaking spoon-fed that he is. And this is kind of amazing to me, because you remember back in the early days, Eric July was talking about how the Rippaverse was not going to spoon-feed you information. You'd have to pick it up as you go. Well, they've got the spoons out in force in this book, at least as far as naming their enemies goes. How would we know that his name is Choke? Well, in his case, he's telling us. And as far as calling him a greater demon, demon. Don't give them a classification. This is the kind of uncertainty you want to leave open to the reader so that the reader can be like, oh my gosh, what the heck is that? Instead of, oh, okay, that's a greater demon. I don't know what a greater demon is, but I guess Bloodruth knows what that is. It's so boring when you give the reader too much information. And now we've got this sound effect splorch, and it's another example of too much information, because do you really think that's what the sound of tearing flesh sounds like? Splorch? We don't need this. What we need is to be given the space to imagine for ourselves what it sounds like when flesh is ripped apart like that. I'm sure that whatever is in your readers' heads is going to be so much more entertaining and scary than this splorch sound effect that just looks comical, and even in the way that it's drawn is comical. You want to give the readers the ability to fill in the gaps for themselves so that they can fill it in with the most horrifying thing possible. Don't volunteer sound effects like that. Now, of course, this is the famous two-page spread that got split up, but one of the things I want to point out, which I'm not sure I pointed out in my video that was covering this two-page spread in great detail, is the fact that we already get a small reveal of the demon here. Why would you do that? There is no circumstance under which it would not have been a better reveal to see Choke in all of his arm-ripping glory first thing. This scene is a flashback in Sydney's history to when she used to be in her church choir and her family used to attend church. It's an interruption, and I'm just kind of amazed that the Soska Sisters don't see where this obviously belonged. Where you want the flashback to interrupt is from where she's about to see him. You should have Bloodruth about to see him and then cut to a flashback, because that's going to build the suspense. You're going to be like, oh my God, why did this send her back to thinking 20-something years ago, or however old she is in there, 15 years ago, thinking about this church scene where the minister is talking about demons. What is it? What is it? What is it? And then you turn the page and you get this boom, two-page spread of Choke, and it's like, my gosh, it's an actual demon. I don't know why it is the Soskas didn't just intuit this. The battle ends with Choke being overwhelmed and held in place by a bunch of corpses that have been reanimated by Bloodruth's blood magic, and she throws a bottle of holy water into Choke's mouth, which he then swallows and blows up from. Now, the problem I have with this is that this is just a lucky throw. This isn't skill. This isn't even Bloodruth having the corpses hold Choke in place in such a way that they force his mouth open. If the Soskas wanted to impress us, what they should have done was have her use her blood magic to wrap a couple of tendrils around this bottle of holy water and then have those tendrils shove the holy water down his throat so that you could see that it's not just luck, it's skill that's actually making her win this battle. So now it's time for Bloodruth to discover a horrifying secret, and this is actually the book's finest moment here, and this is when Bloodruth discovers a room that contains all of these portals to various Hellion dimensions, and she realizes, oh my God, look at all the potential for death and destruction and devastation contained in this room. This was a mind-blowing scene, and if the book had stopped here, where she had been able to go back to Michael and Lillian saying, okay, guys, the good news is the undesirable you wanted gone is gone. The bad news is I'm the new undesirable because I'm going to keep the castle for myself, because I'm definitely not letting you have access to this room that's full of all of this death and devastation. If the book had decided to end there, it would have been a halfway decent book. I'm not saying it would have been a great book, but it would have been good enough. But of course, it doesn't end there. We've still got a long way to go through just the primary conflict, because first, Bloodruth has to fight another greater demon. This time, it's a stripper. Yes, it's a stripper demon named Deer Tick. I mean, what else are you going to call that outfit? I mean, she's either in the Rockettes or she's a stripper. And again, here we are being spoon-fed the name and the designation of this greater demon, which we just don't need. We're getting her name from this next bit of dialogue that's on the next page. And the only other thing that's interesting about this particular character is that she has a love of books. And then she morphs into a actual bug type form, a deer tick. I guess that's what a deer tick looks like when magnified, or maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Maybe Michael Montanon's just getting creative there. I do like the dialogue balloon where she says, "You think I want to look like this?" Because it gives you a horrific sensation. Anyway, Bloodruth takes care of her by sealing her into a book. And the interesting thing is, I was thinking maybe deer ticks inhabit books, and that's why she's called deer tick. But the only thing that I could find is that it sucks blood and is usually found on deers. So unless there's deerskin books in there, what is the connection between deer tick and books? Don't you think the name and motif of the demon should be at least remotely connected to what it is that the demon loves most? I mean, if you have a demon that likes books, why don't you have a librarian demon? Even a sexy librarian demon. That would be interesting. Now, Bloodruth, exhausted, has another vision of family. And here you have this actually useful bit of information that her brother, or at least the memory of her brother, gives her. But it's buried under so much junk because the vision doesn't end here, kind of like the book needed to end earlier. And it goes to her brother dissolving in fire, and then she's swimming in a lake of corpses, and then she meets another one of her brothers, and it goes on and on and on, so that anything that was useful in her vision gets buried under all the fluff. Then, Bloodruth discovers a new supporting character. He's found in a state of complete dismemberment, and when she realizes he's still alive, she uses her blood magic to basically sew him back together, and he introduces himself as the famed Edward Crowley, the Master Therian. Beast! Ever since I was a child, I had the gift of magic. If he sounds pedantic, it's only because he is. He's one of the most pedantic, boring characters that the Soskas have invented yet. He's supposed to be kind of a dashing, roguish character, but he just comes across if John Constantine was a complete bore. That's all he is. He's supposed to be some sort of warlock and winds up being kind of a comedic foil for her, except he's really not funny. And then she fights another greater demon. This time it's the demon Faye, whose name is again given to us, even though she names herself 1 page later. Here, because Faye has 4 arms, we get some interesting mechanics in which she's going to use 2 of her arms to break out a needle and thread. And the purpose is to basically sew this guy's mouth shut so that he can't cast any more spells. Apparently he's got the ability to banish her, but instead of showing her actually using the needle and thread, where you've got here needle and thread visible but not in use, and then you've also got another of her hands around his face, instantly his mouth is sealed shut, and all of the ew factor and oh god that looks painful factor that would have come from her, stringing it through one of a time is gone. And again, I'm thinking the Soskas were supposed to be masters of horror. How is it that they're getting it so wrong? Now, in the midst of all this, and I'm not going in exact order, but you get the general idea, we get a flashback on Bloodruth's family history, and this is where her family turns out to have been a bunch of happy-go-lucky hellion hunters who then got wiped out by one of the devils or ancient vampires. I mean, again, we're just being told, it's all just spoon-feeding to us. And because of that, she feels like she has the necessary know-how to fight the next creature that comes along, which is another devil called Morningstar, whose name we get yet again, even though we do get the name 2 pages later this time. Now, one of the things that bothers me, especially about this set of panels, is the fact that the Soskas don't give the reader room to breathe. And that's part of the consequence of just having so much packed into this book. But there are certain panels that need to be left to stand on their own. And one of the things that could have been left here is where this devil, fallen angel, what have you, reveals himself and says, "Sydney, I'm overjoyed to meet you face to face," and you get to see him in all his devilish glory, and just leave it at that. Don't have her saying, "This is bad," because now you're having her break in on the thought you were having. This is the reveal. This is the panel for the reveal thoughts. This is not the panel for her to start interacting now. And then here, too, where he says, "I am Morningstar, the eater of worlds. Can you guess why I am here?" Leave the reader room to guess. Don't immediately interrupt with another caption box saying, "Think, Sydney, you have to defeat him. This can't end here." It's like she's ignoring what he's saying, and if she's going to ignore what he's saying, so are we. We're going to think it's unimportant. It reminds me of a scene from Cyberfrog 2 planet, where after 20 years of separation, Cyberfrog and Heather Swain finally meet again. And the scene is absolutely wonderful and touching and emotional until the little freaking brat right at the end drains the energy out of it by saying, yep, like, well, the reader might be impressed by all this, but, me, the kid, I'm unimpressed by it. Don't mix emotions in the same panel. Let a panel breathe and let the reader connect with that panel and then leave change of emotion for the next panel. Now, in this particular scene with the greater demon and the devil, both of whom are still in existence at this point, we have confusion multiplying. And the reason being is because you have the greater demon talking about Bloodruth's holy blood. The holy blood that runs through your veins is a delicacy. But then you have the devil talking about, don't you know about your own blood, Sydney? It's cursed. You have cursed blood. Okay, Religion 101. Holy and cursed are diametrically opposite things. What are you even talking about? And then it says the worlds of the damned can only be opened with the blood of the damned. But I didn't think Sydney was one of the damned. She says we were made to face the damned. That her cursed bloodline was made to face the damned. How is she one of the damned? None of this makes sense. And then, after 5 pages of psychedelic BS, beautifully drawn BS, by the way, it's scenes of hell and damnation and all this kind of blah blah stuff by Michael Montanot, and it's great as far as visually speaking, but it's just a bunch of crap, followed by the most disappointing and anticlimactic victory over evil ever. I guarantee you will be disappointed when you realize just what happens at the end of this book, but I'm not going to show it to you because I really don't want to be spoiling everything in the book. So let's just skip right on to the consequences of the primary conflict. And here, all we really do is dismiss the secondary villains, because as soon as Bloodruth informs them that she's taking possession of the castle, Michael and Lillian just get to squabbling again. And she's like, she took the castle as payment. That was my castle. Why does this keep happening? You really screwed up. And then in one of the only genuinely scary moments in the book, you have Michael Copper asserting himself over Lillian in a way that makes you think he's about to punch her in the face. But all he actually does is take the newspaper from her and points to it, and all of a sudden they've got a new squirrel to follow. It's like, squirrel! I'm not even worried about the house anymore. I mean, we're gonna go do something else. Probably just freaking stupid. Last but not least, you get a little bit of witty banter between Bloodruth and her new supporting character, Edward Crowley. I guess they're trying to liven things up with a little bit of humor after all of the dark and dreary that had come before. And then, of course, because you don't want to make humor the final touch of your horror comic, we get this ominous, omniscient narrator type character going, I've come to witness the beginning of the end, since I've set into motion consequences of a cosmic scale that cannot now be stopped. Others will know. Others will come. It will all happen in Florus Park. And it's just goofy, vague crap that doesn't really clue us in or entice us in any particular way. So there you go. That's the comic. Now, what is the thing that is most wrong with Bloodruth #1? There's plenty of candidates. Is it the borked double-page spread? I mean, yeah, that's kind of a boner right there. Is it too many insert panels on the part of artist Michael Montanot, where you have these panels that wind up slowing the book down? That could be something. How about the god-awful writing by the Soska Sisters, whether it's the confusion over Bloodruth's origin or lines like this from Gooding? And then last but not least, the unnecessary supporting characters, especially the Edward Crowley guy who winds up sticking around at the end of the book. No, it's not any of these things. The thing that is most wrong with Bloodruth #1 is that it's 5 issues trying to be a first issue. If you go back and you look at that big ol' overview, you can easily extract 5 different comic books from it to publish in sequence. For example, Bloodruth fights the demon Choke and acquires the Castle of Portals. Okay, there's your Bloodruth #1 right there. And then in issue 2, Bloodruth discovers Crowley in the castle and fights the demon Fae. There's your next issue. Issue after that, Bloodruth discovers the library's power and fights the demon Deertick. So there you've got another whole issue. Then Bloodruth meets Gooding, who needs her to fight the devil Morningstar. Okay, here you go. Finally, Bloodruth meets Lillian and Michael, who offer her info on her lost family. So you've got all of these elements that obviously could stand alone in their own books, and instead you try to shove them all into a suitcase like a contortionist, and it doesn't work. So it's time for me to render my overall score of Bloodruth number 1. Here are all of the prior entries. Where does Bloodruth number 1 line up on this list? I'm putting it down at the bottom with ISOM number 2 at a 3.0 score because ultimately it suffers from the same problem that ISOM number 2 had. It really shares in common that sense of scatteredness. It just feels like a mess that has been all packed into one comic. And I gotta say, when Bloodruth number 2 comes out, if the Soska Sisters don't come up with an idea that is an absolute banger as far as, a synopsis of what's supposed to be in that book, I don't even think I'm going to pick it up. I don't even think I'm going to give my audience the opportunity to bribe me into picking it up because this was just such a wretched read that I don't have any confidence in their writing ability anymore. It's bad enough that I'm going to have to pick up those miserable one-shots with Michael Copper and Lillian Renashi and written by the individual Soska Sisters. I really don't want to, but at the same time, I think to myself, maybe if they don't together have the writing talent necessary to actually carry off a comic, maybe one of them on her own can actually pull something off. So that is my evaluation of Bloodruth number 1. Ultimately, it is a try-hard horror comic. It is not up to the kind of standards that you would expect from people who are supposed to be masters in their field of horror. Thank you very much. I'm Mike Partika. I appreciate your watching these 3 review videos of Bloodruth number 1. If you haven't seen the first 2, I do urge you to get a look at those and then subscribe so that you will be notified of future book reviews. I think the next one I'm going to do is finally Liam Gray's Dino King. So be on board. Definitely hit the subscribe button so you can see how a non-Rippaverse book does for a change. I definitely need the palate cleanser. Thanks again for watching. I will talk to you later.